Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are joining us from today. Welcome to Building Invincible Trust Chains with Strong Authentication and ID Verification, an expert webinar presented by FindBiometrics and our premier financial industry event partner, Money 2020 Europe.
Hello everyone, my name is Gary Dempsey. I am a content leader from Money 2020 Europe. I just wanted to say a huge thank you to everyone from our partners FindBiometrics for organizing today's webinar. I cannot wait to listen in on the webinar, but first I wanted to tell you a little bit more about this year's Money 2020 Europe. I wanted to start with our content. This year we decided to throw out the conference rulebook and developed our content around 8 big industry questions. The 8 big questions came about when we went out to the industry to speak with a number of our delegates and partners from across sectors. We wanted to speak to as many stakeholders as possible to understand challenges, priorities, and goals of leaders in finance and tech for 2020 and beyond. We also found that almost every conference in the space is theming their shows around subsectors like banking, payments, and blockchain. We knew we needed to change this up, and the research delivered these questions to us through the people we were interviewing. We threw out the subsectors of the past and based our content around our 8 big questions. These are the 8 big questions which apply to every business, and every business should be asking themselves these questions over the next year. The hard-hitting questions were developed last year following our research and are now even more relevant in a post-COVID-19 world. These questions will help you work out how to adapt to a continuously evolving environment, how to get comfortable with the constant change, deal with uncertainty, work out new differentiators, and stay ahead of the competition. I want to delve deeper into question 7 for a moment. Why can't we get trust right? Trust has been and will remain one of the most pressing challenges in the industry because there is a variety of market or vertical specific solutions, but we haven't yet figured it out globally. How do you securely connect and conduct business with someone you will never meet? Or how do you enable universal and secure access to public services online? It all comes down to trust. And trust, although it may not seem so immediately, it is a very operational term that ties together everything identity, privacy, and security. At Money 2020 Europe this September, we want to showcase various approaches of innovators to building the fabric of trust between individuals and the private and public sectors. The US, Europe, and APAC have vastly different experiences with systems of trust, so who's to say which is the right model? We don't aim to give you a definitive answer to what the system of trust should look like, because there hasn't been and unlikely to be a single right answer. But we do want to show you a variety of players attempting to build and own the layer of trust, tying together identity, security, and convenience. And it's particularly important now when we are operating fully in an online environment and fraud has a much stronger impact on everyone. Various stakeholders are trying to build the identity layer of the world to access the next billion customers, but there is no one size fits all, which is why the question is so open-ended in its nature. Within this question, we have some super exciting sessions. In how to build a digital nation, we're going to explore how to build an identity system that works for everyone, everywhere, covering best-in-class examples of digital nations. We'll take a look at why we haven't got a pan-European identity scheme yet. We'll be discussing whether we can get to a regional or even global unified identity layer, addressing issues like standardization and interoperability, as well as the role and place of solutions rolled out by the big tech companies. We'll also look at examples of decentralized and centralized identity systems. And that brings us nicely onto the topic of data. From a consumer perspective, how can customers take control what's happening with their personal data? And from a business perspective, how can companies create value from data for themselves and for their customers? I've highlighted just a small piece of the amazing content that sits under our trust question, and these are the amazing speakers we'll have delivering you the answers. For more information on our topics, you can see our regularly updated agenda at europe.money2020.com. I've covered our content and our speakers. I now just want to tell you a little bit more about the event this year. So the industry has told us that they are eager to getting business moving again. So from Tuesday 22nd to Thursday 24th of September 2020, we are returning to the RAI in Amsterdam to reunite the industry. We are fully committed to reconnecting the industry safely though. So as you can imagine, things are going to be a bit different this year. We are working very closely with the Dutch government to ensure we can deliver an outstandingly but safe experience. And one of the important changes we've made this year is that we're going to cap our audience at 4,000 compared to nearly 6,500 last year, to ensure networking can be done at a safe distance. As risk levels change around the world, so do measures and requirements, which is why we are continuously monitoring the situation and are updating everything we are doing on our website to ensure the safety of our partners and our delegates. You'll notice we are introducing a number of safety measures to make sure everyone can still have powerful conversations across the industry with peace of mind. These measures include limiting capacity and safe distancing in our theatres, networking lounges and catering areas. We'll have wider aisles. We'll also have floor markings in the aisles in places where queues may form. We'll also have hand sanitizer all across the venue and increased numbers of registration points. For more information on how you can join us or take part, please visit our website at europe.money2020.com. Thank you so much for your time today, and I look forward to seeing you this September in Amsterdam.
Well, thank you very much, Gary. Gary Dempsey, content leader, Money 2020 Europe. It's a great way to set the stage for us, and we are looking forward to seeing you in September in Amsterdam, and are very heartened for all of the different precautions that you're taking for this event. My name again, for everybody, I'm Peter Cantor. I'm the editor-in-chief of FindBiometrics, Mobile ID World, and I will be your moderator for the rest of this event. Today's webinar is sponsored by Knock Knock Labs, BioCatch, Onfido, and FaceFee. It will last approximately 45 minutes to 1 hour, and will introduce, at the end we will include an audience question and answer period. For those of you wishing to participate, please type your questions into the questions field on your go-to panel as you think of them. Our behind the scenes team will be collecting audience questions throughout the panel and aggregating them so that we can cover as many requested topics as possible. And with that out of the way, we can start the show. As Gary mentioned, we have a trust problem in our digital lives. And that's reflected by the key question in Money 2020 Europe's agenda: why can't we get trust right? The COVID-19 response, which has accelerated remote digital experiences like work, education, and banking, has amplified that challenge. We're seeing fraud rates climb now in the wake of a decade characterized by historic data breaches, while at the same time, privacy concerns are high in the minds of consumers and relying parties alike. As a related side note, just a few weeks ago, I'm sure many of you know, we observed the 2-year anniversary of GDPR. And it's really fascinating to look back on how society has evolved in terms of trust, privacy, and security since then. Our partners and readers understand that the key to getting trust right lies in digital identity technologies. And that's what our conversation is about today. To discuss trust in today's digital financial landscape, I am pleased to introduce today's expert panel. Ayelet Bigger-Levine, Vice President, Product Marketing at BioCatch, Javier Mira, CEO of FaceFee, Dr. Rolf Lindemann, Vice President of Products at Knock Knock Labs, and Hussein Kasai, CEO of Onfido. Panelists, thank you for joining me today on this webinar. Let's start things off. If we want to talk about solving for trust, I think we need to start with a high-level conversation. So broadly, my first question is, what are the key elements to a foundation of trust in financial services? Javier, can you start this off, please?
Thank you, Peter, for the introduction, and just say hello to all the audience and my colleagues in the panel. Answering the first question, key elements for a foundation of trust in financial service, I would say that if we go back many years ago, the trust of people with the financial entities was based on, I was approaching a physical branch, I was visiting the director of the office, and the image of the branch offices was impacting me about the furniture, the way they look in front of me, the way they speak to me about the bank, and what the services and products that they can offer me. So the image was the first impression that I had time ago. Today, all financial entities, all banks are trying to change completely the way the digital transformation is here, and they are all trying to do it properly. And the system is changing completely. Now all they are trying to fight in order to acquire new customers, with a big difference that it's without any physical contact. So financial entities came from giving a nice image of the branch offices, the logo, big banks, big investments, and so on, to be a very innovative bank, trying to deliver the best solution, technological solutions, the best options in order to open a new account without going to the offices. And that's why they need to build trust. And the trust is by saying, hey, we do have nice technologies, very highly secure processes in order to do to have or to offer the best user experience, and at the same time be sure that we are managing your identity very careful. We have the data very protected. Everything should be under control. Your data is not going to be traveling through internet to any possible hackers and to give you some problems. So this is the image that the banks today are trying to give new users. And I think that the key elements are those. It's just to be able to transmit that the solutions they are offering today to the end user are secure, nice user experience, and everything should be. And they are really aware about the privacy, as we can see in the last stage. That's my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Rolf, what do you have to say on this topic?
So we have started the internet with a very insecure and legacy type of authentication method, right? So everything we are using today is essentially based on bearer tokens like passwords and even one-time passcodes, right? And those technologies are very ancient. We are using the services, the online services, in a completely different way now, right? There's so much reliance on those digital services and on the authenticity of the transactions we are performing on the internet, which no one would have imagined 30 or 40 years ago, right? And so we really have to understand that on the internet, once first, the competition is only a click away, right, which drives a need for very convenient user experience. And second, the attackers are there and they will continue to attack. And so if we do not provide robust security measures and only are in a kind of arms race with the attackers just a half of a step ahead, right, then that's not a good enough. And I think that's what we see in the card not present in the payment world these days, that just using the bearer tokens like your credit card number and maybe the CVV, which is printed on your card as a first factor, doesn't scale, which by the way is the reason why regulators stepped up and said, banks, this doesn't count as a factor. Right? Equally, we have seen that knowledge-based authentication, right, or using social security numbers to understand who that identity is, right, is not good enough for authentication. It might be good for identification, but not to understand and have a robust method to understand who the entity on the other end of the line is. So the time is really ripe to have a new approach to identity in the internet, which really scales globally, right, and gets rid of all the legacy stuff to which we have added lots of band-aids, which makes it brittle, more complicated, but not substantially more secure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Especially, I think there's a lot of resonance here with what you talked about in terms of a fraud and security arms race. Ayelet, what would you like to add to this discussion?
Thank you, Peter. I think to build on what Javier and Rolf talked about, I think they're really trust really goes both ways. The consumer must trust the service, the financial service, and the service also needs to trust the consumer. And we talked a little bit about we want to make sure that the person is who they say they are on the other side, and putting the right controls in, and also building the trust that the service provider has the right controls. But it's also about knowing that what they are doing is legitimately what they should be doing and what they intend to do. Because even if the user is who they claim to be, they might be under attack. They might be under a scam. They might have a kind of a remote access attack on their device. So I would say that verifying that the user is who they claim to be is not enough, definitely not at one point in time. And then there's also the other way, the trust that goes to the consumer. And this is a little challenging because I think trust goes beyond the security controls. Trust is about the brand and knowing that with this brand, you're always safe because the brand is looking holistically at all their different facets. So one example is, and a very challenging one, attacks that happen beyond the scope of the brand. So it's not on my digital channel, it's actually a phishing attack that happens outside of my digital channel. Or it's not about, it might be rogue apps, all sorts of scams. So really looking holistically at building trust, because once you you break the trust with the consumer, it's really hard to build it back. There's word of mouth, there's conversations on social media. So it's all about taking a holistic approach and also ensuring going beyond authentication and identity corroboration, and also ensuring that throughout the process, the user is doing what you expect them to do and they're really acting with intent. So taking it to the level of intent is a part of that.
Absolutely. And what you're saying about the holistic method really does speak to the topic of the day, which is trust chains and the larger ecosystem here. Hussein, do you have anything to add to this question here?
Thank you, Peter, and it's good to be on. Only the extent to which, just to recognize there's a difference depending on which customer group you are looking to address. So in a crude way, you can split up maybe the smartphone generation to the somewhat the previous generation. And the difference is the older generation, typically trust came from a few signals such as what is the legacy, what is the history of this institution, financial institution, how old are they, how established are they, how large is their asset book, for instance. So if you look at Wells Fargo, the famous horse and carriage gives you that impression and signal that this is very well established and very large, and therefore trust is typically derived in that way. But the smartphone generation are somewhat different in some ways. For one thing, most in the last 10 years especially have essentially grown up by using smartphones. And they're used to, whether it started with MySpace, later Facebook, the Twitter interface, and so on, a much stronger, easier user experience and user interface. So typically, if you ask a smartphone generation user, what do you associate brands that you trust? What you typically find is less about the legacy or the history, but more about how easy are they to use, how transparent are they, how straightforward is the service, how easy is it to register, and in our sort of broader identity speak and discussion, that's especially relevant. And in some ways, the fintech ecosystem grew as a result of 2008 in particular. And when you look around as examples, the neobanks such as Monzo, they actually publish quite a bit around the very specifics around any metrics or anything related to what may be in the consumer's ultimate interest. So this key distinction I wanted to make is around depending on which customer demographic you might be talking to.
It's a very important distinction, and now that we have sort of established this idea of trust broadly, it also brings up the question that we've all sort of touched on here so far, which is what's at risk if trust isn't present between a user and an institution or the relying party. Ayelet, because you'd already kind of mentioned the sort of two-way door of this relationship, I was wondering if you could start on this, please.
Yeah, and I think that's really key here is to understand, what is that risk? Because we talk a lot about the balance of friction and fraud and what is our tolerance for risk and trust really has to play an element of that. We really need to gain the right level of trust that correlates with the risk that's acceptable for a financial service. So the risk if we don't establish that trust is that, if we talk about the two ways, so from a user perspective, if they don't trust the service, they're going to take their business elsewhere. We're going to lose the lifetime value of that customer And it will impact word of mouth, social media, and we see that trickle effect. Everything is rated today, so all services are rated, and this goes to financial, banks, merchants, and so on and so on. And then the flip side for organizations, if they're not able to put in the element of trust, so fraud is definitely one of the risks, but I think then, as Hussein introduced, the friction is another flip side of that. So if you're not able to build the trust in an easy way, you'll have to layer on controls, because eventually it's that balance between the level of risk you're willing to take. So putting friction into the process is another risk of losing good customers potentially. So that's from that perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really important distinction as well. Hussein, would you like to jump in on this, please?
Yep. So as to whether there's risk or not, potentially no risk if the consumer doesn't have an alternative or other options. So this is very much related to how necessary is that financial service. If there's only one provider in town, then really there's almost no risk because there's no alternative. And that's why it's relevant when you consider an increasing number of options that are coming into the market and offering financial services. The cost of entering the industry is significantly reduced. You don't need to have many servers in a warehouse anywhere. You can use cloud computing. You can get a license specific to, say, payments or remittance. You don't need maybe a whole banking license as you may have had in the past. So this growth in competition has, in essence, made it easier for individuals and users to switch, and that has driven, in a good sense, a lot of great innovation and sort of a more focused effort around delivering to end consumers what they want. So in essence, given how core trust is to all of finance, and given now that there are a greater number of alternatives, it makes it, the risk has risen if this is an area that's neglected.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Rolf, I'm curious to hear you weigh in on this, given that your contribution to our first talking point was so historically deep in terms of the internet. So yeah, what is at risk here if we don't have trust?
I think I have two comments to make here. The first is we are often inherently assuming that there's always a trade-off scenario between convenience and security. There are a few, very few in the end, technologies which help us getting out of that. For example, today, that single-step authentication with passwords versus two-step verification with password plus SMS OTP is a typical example of those kind of trade-offs, right? The password is more convenient, right? Password alone, but two-step verification is more secure. However, there are alternative approaches like FIDO, for example, and the technology knock offers, which make sure that you can have the user convenience, which is even better than the convenience of entering a password, right? Just a very easy biometric gesture, which at the same time can provide you a strong two-factor authentication, which is even more secure than the traditional two-step verification. So for me, getting out of those boxes where we used to live in, or have to live in the past, right, is important. And number two is, there is, in most existing schemes or old schemes, there is an inherent reliance on the user to understand to what reliant the user is talking, right? So if I enter the password and I enter the password to a phishing site, meaning not to my bank, right, or my whatever reliant party, but to that man in the middle website, all bets are off, right? That's an easy attack vector for the man in the middle, and very similar with SMS OTP, right? If I enter that SMS OTP to the wrong website, all bets are off, right? So from that perspective, it's very important that we fix those fundamental security assumptions and boxes we lived in the past for the last, whatever, 30, 40 years, and get to a model which is adequate for the internet the way we use it today. Meaning it does not put a burden on the user to know what relying party they are talking to from a security perspective. Sure, they want to know whether they're talking to their bank, right, from a privacy perspective, but at least from a security perspective, we can help the user and get that load off his shoulders. And second, we can get out of that trade-off with always assuming that higher security means less convenience, right? Less usability. There are ways where we can combine both, and it's important that we can find those ways, because the impact on the business is substantial, not only from a fraud reduction perspective, also from an increased user engagement perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Javier, I would like to get you to weigh in on this, please.
I think that I'm trying to answer shortly the question. The risk, if you are not able, if you are an entity, a financial entity or relying party, and you're not able to build a trust chain with your customer, the risk is absolutely enormous. The risk means everything. If from the user point of view, if any product you try to buy, any services you try to access, the company is not giving you trust, or you don't feel this trust while you are executing the service of the product, you are done. I mean, everything is based on trust. It was 50 years ago, and it's gonna be today. The big difference is that 50 years ago, the trust, as I was mentioning before, was somehow in the same space physically, where two people or two persons were talking about the services or the product, and someone is convincing the other one about the security and how the product is going to be used, etc. And now it's a long distance between the user and the financial entity. It could be thousands of miles, and the process is exactly the same. So I think it's mandatory that today financial entities or relying parties have to have the correct documentation and trust involvement in order to transmit to the end user that the processes are changing, but at the same time that the processes are completely based on trust. Otherwise, it's a big risk.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that actually flows into something else I'd like to just touch on before we get into actually building on broken trust change, which is, as I mentioned at the top of this presentation, and also as Gary mentioned, and as we all know from living, we have had an extra factor thrown into everything in the form of the pandemic. So my question is, how has the rapid shift to remote living and further remote finance spurred on by the COVID-19 pandemic affected identity in finance? And what new challenges does it present in terms of engineering trust between all transactional parties? Hussein, can I get you to start on this one, please?
Of course. So I believe there's been significant and strong growth as far as online and digital financial service providers go, in the sense that the need has always been there. It's just now the offline or more traditional means of gaining access have become less convenient, or in fact, there's now a health risk associated with, say, going inside a physical bank branch, at least in the near term. And so it's well documented, the growth in payments and remittance especially. So as for other changes, there are, what we have seen is more and more of the large enterprises and sort of mainstream banks, they've brought forward some of their launch dates or digitization plans. And in parallel, we are now increasingly sort of in the space as a whole financial service community at thinking about experiences even more, which does include, perhaps where appropriate, moving more towards whether it's contactless or sort of cashless scenarios. And now there's this added dimension of hygiene and risk, so that previously touchless payments, for example, was a kind of a convenience thing, but now there's an added driver around hygiene and I suppose risk that's going to probably continue to accelerate that. Those are the factors that I spring to mind.
Mm-hmm. And Alialet, what do you think?
Okay. Yeah, no, we've seen you know, a lot of change with COVID-19, and a few interesting nuggets. I think we saw, first of all, there's when talking to our customers, we see an increase in digital channel use. That's not a surprise, but the increase is about 250%. So we're really seeing the digital first here, and that's why it's so critical. And just as Javier said, we see projects expedited to really think about how to improve the services on digital channels, but also the security. And when it comes to the impact of COVID-19 on fraud, we also saw, increase in phishing scams and all these attacks that will eventually find their way into fraud. And some interesting points that we've seen, and also talking to analysts, is that organizations are shifting their predictions from around 8% decrease in fraud losses to an increase of 10 to 15%. So with digital first, really there needs to be a way to really reduce the friction and enable that customer experience. So they're looking to leverage additional technologies to really accelerate digital channels and reduce the friction at the same time. So just like Rolf talked about earlier, how can we reduce the friction? Another point of talking about the impact of, so that's from the kind of the consumer perspective and their activity, but there's also the service provider angle. Think about, the service providers are moving from office environment where they have some inspection on the way they work to working from home. And some of our customers have been telling us that, trusting the remote workforce is a little bit of a challenge. The liberty that they might take to themselves is greater than potentially when they are in the office, supervised. So, ensuring that not only that they are who they claim to be, but they're doing what they're supposed to be doing is a challenge, and that may impact trust if they're sniffing around customer accounts, for example. And then there's the challenge of the operations, right? The remote workforce, they're so used to working together and collaborating, now taking that, and that is a fundamental part of the trust process, the operational aspect of trust. In addition, we're also seeing, there is the financial impact, and the financial impact draws a lot of creativity. And we've heard of a number of use cases, given the nature of what we do at BioCatch, which is, analyze physical and cognitive behavior to detect patterns of good and bad, and really detect fraud and identity theft, and at the same time improve customer experience. So, different use cases come to us, and I think the impact of COVID-19 really plays in here when they say, we have an account holder, a service provider, we're a platform, we're kind of the relying party. So, think about rideshare or TaskRabbit, for example, just as an example, or those kinds of services where you have an account, you're rated, you are, the account holder, you're a legitimate user with the high rate, and that's really a valuable account to hold. But now, you can only work so many hours a day, and the financial situation is not so good, so you want to make a few extra bucks on the side, so you actually take that account and share it with someone else. So that's really an interesting thing. And how do we verify that it's really the user who's providing the service, even if it's a remote service, like design services, or how do we know it's the user that is actually that person? Is something that goes into the trust and making sure that, users can trust the service. So that's really, even if they have access to the credentials or can satisfy multi-factor authentication to some forms, really ensuring that it's that user is another aspect here. So crime is very creative in the ways that it's evolving.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what you just mentioned about digital first does fit in with what Rolf was saying earlier about the card not present transactions and whatnot. Rolf, what do you have to add to this topic?
So for me, the current situation is really an accelerator of all the digitization we have discussed in the past. First example for me is the secure perimeter assumption, right? If you go back, I think already in 24, people started saying the secure perimeter assumption is dead, right? Corporates should not have that assumption. But that was more a theoretical discussion. Now, with all working from home office, right, this is reality, right? And this transition was relatively quickly. So now people have to realize what kind of assumptions they made, which are not longer true, meaning that people are in a corporate office physically connected to a corporate secured local area network, right? So with us working remotely, the secure perimeter is dead, and zero trust is really a live and practical reality these days, right? Or the need for that, right? And people have realized that very suddenly in some way. The second aspect is bring your own device. Right? In the past, companies wanted to have control, right? And sometimes the control is more a security theater, right? They wanted to force people to use standardized technology to access corporate networks and all that stuff. Now, with all the home office work, we realize that in some way we can't give out new devices to our employees to work from home, right? They have to take what they have at home, meaning bring your own device. So we have to live and find good security mechanisms, right, which do not require the conversion of a personal device into a corporate device, right? So meaning how can you add strong authentication to those devices? And you need technology for that. The next one is really the relevance of branch offices, right? In the past, people were going to the branch office and for onboarding purposes, would get ID proof there, right? Now we understand this has to work remotely and instantly, right? Because people want to sign up for new services, for new accounts, to do new stuff, right? And with that, we also see that I would call it the poor man's delegation concept, right? I just give a friend my Netflix password and username, right? Just to share that same Netflix account with that friend, right? This is not a delegation scheme which was built into the protocol or into the service by nature. It's a workaround people found just to get what they wanted to get, meaning the ability to delegate to some friends. Now, sometimes this becomes a boomerang, right? It comes back and creates a security challenge where we don't want that, right? So we heard that sometimes people start sharing things which is more a crime thing, right? A crime scenario. Now we want to detect those. How can we do that? Using authentication methods which do not allow for easy bearer token sharing, but rely on other approaches which are more secure, and for sure also provide these delegation methods, but now in a controlled way, so that customers can use the delegation, but in a secure manner, controlled by the business, right, and according to the business rules, so that everything is still secure, but always provide the customer experience and the features the customers really want, right? Otherwise, customers would turn away and go to the next click on the internet, meaning the competition, right? So for me, this is really, COVID-19 is an accelerator of all the things we have discussed over the last at least decade, right, or so. Mm-hmm. And now we see and we have to keep up with all these changes in a very quick way.
Absolutely, yes. And Javier, feel free to weigh into that question as well, but I want to have you start off on this next one as well, which is, since we sort of naturally transitioned into the actual ecosystems of trust here, trust starts with knowing your customer and anchoring trust and identity. We see this quite a bit now, especially given the panel we have with ID verification technologies, remote digital onboarding. What identity threats still exist in the onboarding process, and how can they be solved?
Thank you, Peter. Just a few words about the COVID-19 pandemic. Mm-hmm. I think it affected a lot to identity in finance. A lot means, in my opinion, that we are today on the panel, we are really believers of the digital solutions that we are trying to promote. Is a very nice solution, and we think that it's something really interesting to the market, to end user, etc. I think the big change with the pandemic is that now financial entities, but also end users, they already know that these digital solutions are more necessary than ever. It's a big change in mentality. I received a lot of emails from investors, from FaceFee, or from colleagues, worldwide people saying, okay, now we need this type of solutions because now we need to build trust in this contactless solution between entities and end users. So I believe that the big change about the COVID-19 is that from the mentality point of view, I think many people now it's accepting the usage of this type of technology. That's what I think. And about the second question, identity threats in the onboarding process. Well, I would say that generally speaking, I would say that there is one key or two key points here. One is the verification, obviously, of the document, to avoid that it's not a copy, a fake document, and this is a hard part of the process. And the other one is how to verify that the person it's alive and it's not a video or it's not a picture. Those 2 points are the main points that at least entities, financial entities, are asking face fee in all the process that we are involved. And obviously, both problems can be solved using technology. You know that more and more, all companies like face fee, we all have different systems, but at the end, trying to do the same. That it's verification of the person, verification of the identity, and obviously to be capable to say that this person is alive and is not a fake person. 2 years ago, it was impossible to do that. Today, it's completely possible, and in fact, it's on production in millions of users, and I think it's already solved. So the threats in the digital onboarding process, I think that it's more now being capable to have the thousands of documents that you have worldwide, to have modulated these documents in order to do the process correctly, and in some cases to manage the data in order to. Some banks, they prefer to have on the cloud, some of the banks, they prefer to have on premise. So it depends on the type of architecture that the financial entity wants, which I think this is a big threat now, in order to try to cover all the aspects.
Absolutely. And Hussein, you're also a specialist in remote digital onboarding. What would you say are the current threats, and how can they be solved?
So to share the scale of it, according to the United Nations, up to 5% of the world GDP is laundered money. That's almost $2 trillion. And naturally, it's typically used in human trafficking, drug trafficking, terrorist financing. And what is worse is that 99% of those funds are successful in being transferred or laundered. So as an industry, in some ways, you could think of us as collectively having a 99% failure rate or a 1% success rate, which is a really bad statistic on many counts. And so there's a lot of work to be done. And as for the threats at the onboarding stage in particular, the unfortunate fact of the data breaches has meant centralized databases, whether it's credit bureau or knowledge-based questions and so on, they seem to have lost their currency to some extent, given that they are now potentially more vulnerable. So moving more towards whether it's biometrics or our focus being government ID and biometrics, part of the reason why it's taken on and become significantly more popular is because of getting this right balance between offering security and yet a good customer experience at the same time. And if there's one point to, I suppose, finish off on, it's around the importance of recognizing that it's typically 1% of the fraudsters for in some scenarios can count for up to 70% of the fraud. So even if there is an option that is, say, 1% better than an alternative, typically that would deter a fraudster, and the fraudster would go to another platform that would be easier to breach. And so there's a continuous effort needed to continuously upgrade and improve, give fraud measures, especially given that fraudsters are equally working continuously to find a way of cheating systems.
Absolutely. So we're getting a ton of questions in. Keep them coming, everybody. Our team is aggregating them and summarizing them for me. We'll get to audience questions shortly, but I did want to build on that foundation again with obviously the trust chain starts with the anchor that Javier and Hussein just laid out there. But after a customer is onboarded, there need to be steps taken to protect their identity in this ongoing trust chain, privacy, their user experience, etc. Things that we have touched on. Rolf, what would you say are the steps that can be taken in order to protect an identity after it's been verified?
So for me, I would really start to look into the differences we have today first, and then answer your question specifically, right? The first, I think the observation is ID proofing and recognizing returning customers are two separate things. Threats are seen against both of them, but they have to be solved in a different way. It's interesting that recognizing returning customers, what we typically call authentication, can be standardized, and there are global standards out there which address that problem on a global scale. The ID proofing stuff is inherently regional, right? First, because the requirements are diverse, right? Cloud storage providers typically don't care about your real government issued or backed identity, right? They are typically more, let's say, looking just to recognize you as a customer. And if you're the so-called dog on the internet, that's fine for them as well, right? Banks on the other end of the spectrum, they do care, and they are tightly regulated to care. So they have to really do a lot of steps to do the ID proofing, get the ID proofing right. But those steps inherently depend on the geography, right? If you leave the in-branch verification out of scope for a moment and just look at the remote ID proofing, right? In Germany, we have the national identity card, which is an electronic card. So we can remotely prove our government endorsed identity, right, in a very secure and privacy friendly manner, right, and even do the binding right, and then create a derived credential with strong binding for that. So everything could be under control here, but in other countries, those electronic ID cards do not necessarily exist, right? For example, South Africa or the United States, right? And so in those countries, you need to find other ways to do remote ID proofing, which are strong enough to protect against the typical attacks, right? And as Hussein mentioned, right, there's a small number of fraudsters which create a very large number of fraud in the end, right? So they might be sophisticated even, right? And we still need to protect against those. So the document verification in a remote way is relevant, verifying that the person which is sitting on the other side is really the legitimate holder of that document and not just some attacker which found or faked that document, right? And the third is making sure that the binding to that derived credential we are issuing afterwards for recognizing the customer or authenticating the customer for subsequent accesses is also done in a secure manner, right? These different aspects, they all have to implement it in a secure way, and the security aspects are really different, and the requirements on those are different and need to be discussed separately.
Absolutely. And Alulet, can I have you weigh in on this as well in terms of protecting identities after the onboarding process?
Yeah, so definitely an interesting point I think that Rolf talked about, but I do want to go a little back to the onboarding process as well, because I think that's where things really are connected to both, and then I'll address both. So from an onboarding perspective, I think we all talked about things, but there's a lot of friction still, and we need to take into consideration that friction and how we reduce it, because going digital first, challenger banks today have really thought deeply on the experience, and you know, it's all about how many clicks does it take to onboard. And if you look at traditional larger financial institutions today, I would say that it takes maybe 32 clicks versus 7 clicks to onboard someone. So how can we cut that shorter and eliminate the friction to really gain that customer and not have attrition on the way? And I think classic controls, we talked about the fact that identity is not a form of authentication, it's a form of identification. Device reputation solutions out there are not useful at all at account opening unless it happens coincidentally to be a known device, but the likelihood of that is very small. So in addition to, we talked about document verification and ensuring and liveness detection, but that is also a form of friction. But looking at things like how the user behaves to understand and distinguish between good and bad patterns. So if for example, if someone is using a lot of copy paste, it might be someone who's using stolen information. If they're using their short-term memory to enter data versus using their long-term memory, that means that they're not very familiar with their data. Or if they're quickly navigating through the application process, only completing mandatory fields, not making decisions or hesitating, they're likely to be a criminal who's very familiar with that application form. Or if we could look at things like, your declared age at account opening is 60, but in reality, the way you type, the way you click, the way you move your mouse, we can say that it looks like you're 30. So all of those things together are very, very powerful, and that's how BioCatch deals with the friction and the security the onboarding process. Now, transitioning to protecting post-login, I think, you know, or within the account lifecycle, I think key is within the account lifecycle, because definitely login protection is critical, but then you have to really continually monitor the activity within the account, because some types of attacks are very, very subtle within the account lifecycle. For instance, if it is the legitimate user accessing, but they're under a scam and someone is tricking them into transfer money, which you know, authorized push payment fraud is a big deal in the UK and other countries in Europe as well. So really being able to say, yes, this is the user, so profiling the user, understanding their unique profile and really gaining insight into that user and distinguishing them from others, but also looking at patterns on over the whole population to gain those behavioral insights is our approach to kind of holistic visibility into user activity from both behavioral biometrics and cognitive and cognitive aspect of what they're doing. So both, do they look like themselves with the way they behave, but also do they look under what is their current emotional state? Is it the one we expect it to be when they're performing this type of activity? So that's a very, very powerful combination, and that is enabling our customers to really deal with those two elements.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And, you know, I think that there's a lot here that that there is in terms of a conversation to respond to. It also crests with one of the questions that we have from the audience here. The question goes, we've been talking about getting rid of the password and other legacy ID styles like questions and one-time passwords for years. End user customers are extremely frustrated. Why is this taking so long? I would like to throw this to Hussein first, and then anybody who has something to add to that, please just jump in free-for-all style.
I share the frustration. Passwords, we're all very used to them, but there are so many different challenges and issues with them, and increasingly they seem just very out of date. It's, you know, not lost upon me that almost 50 years ago we could find a way to go to the moon, and yet it's difficult for me to prove that I am me when interacting with a simple device. So part of this is essentially going back to getting the right balance between user friction and security. And I'm quite convinced that in the next 5 years, we're going to move away from passwords as we know them today and have something that is much more identity and quite possibly biometrics led and driven. So we are working on what we call portable identity, and there are pilots ongoing to show how this would work. And I'm sure others have similar initiatives. And I'm, again, very confident that over the next 5 years, passwords will be something that we're going to all look back and think about how odd it was for us to have been so reliant on them.
I can't wait. But do any other panelists have anything to add to this this question of what's taking so long with killing the password?
So
this is Javier. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
go ahead.
no,
Okay, thank you.
First.
No, I'm just subscribing all that Hussein said. But just pay attention to this. Remember where we were 5 years ago in terms of passwords and other types of authentication, and where are we today in terms of passwords and authentication? It's a big jump. Today, there is a lot of people using biometric authentication on the smartphones, using on the web services, and using access control, going step by step into the airports and governments, etc. 5 years ago was the message, was a theory, and today it's a real thing. Probably in the next 5 years, it's going to be accepted by many of the rest of the people. So I totally agree with Hussein.
Rolf, have at it.
So, as I already said in my first statement, right, we are somehow used to using bearer token approaches. They have some nice characteristics, and this is we can use them over the top, right? We do not need any support from any system to just pass those through. But on the other hand, that's also their security weakness, right? So since it's so easy to pass those bearer tokens like passwords or OTPs through, and even other information we collected from the device, right? We cannot really trust and know whether we got that information from the legitimate user or from some attacker, right? And so we have to make sure that we always combine a local security measure and local interaction, which is biometric, for example, what the user can do with a local device, right? User reaches local only, right? So I can only touch things which are local to me. I can things can listen to me which are local, right? But not over the Atlantic, for example, right? Where remote servers might be. So we have to make sure that we have approaches for having that local user interaction simple enough, more and convenient, and secure, robust enough. But on the other hand, we need cryptographically secured systems for remote communication between such local systems and the remote servers on the other end of the wire, right? And putting these two worlds together, that took some time, right? And we really needed to convince first the cryptography side of the house, which said, no, we don't need the biometrics. And sometimes we needed to convince the biometric side of the house, of the ecosystem, to say, oh, we can do all that without the cryptography. Reality is we can't, right? We need both. We need to combine both in a very sophisticated way. And then the understanding the two types of attacks we are seeing in the world, which is the things which are scalable, right, and the things which only work in a very targeted manner. And the scalable attacks are creating the biggest problem in the industry, right? That is the reason for the billions of passwords which were stolen, right? Or the millions and tens of millions of phishing attacks and so on, right? So we need to protect against the scalable attacks first, and then against the targeted attacks. And so we need technologies which are somehow incorporated to those devices, right? That's the reason why we created the FIDO Alliance 9 years or 8 years ago, right? And now all the major players are inside that alliance to transform their platforms and add support for that, right? And we are at a stage where you can use that already in a very ubiquitous manner. So we have done all the heavy lifting already, and now it's ready for prime time since a couple of years already, and people start using that. And this is really a game changer, because this gets us out of the arms race where we are just a half a step ahead of the attacker. Now we are playing in a completely different league, right? Because it's so difficult to rip out the cryptographic material from phones, and I would have to steal the device from users, which works for a targeted attack but doesn't scale really, right? Because that's too much effort for each individual. But to get to that stage, that needed us some time, right? Now we are there already, and we can start using that, which means that the convenience is really improving for the user side. We can get to a single gesture authentication, even for high value payments, right? Which is more convenient than just providing a single password, right? And not even comparing that to the two-step verification, which most people implement these days, where people have to enter passwords plus SMS OTP, or have to wait for some seconds and then enter the SMS OTP. Right, so I think we are in a good place, but it took some time to convince the platforms to add support for that.
Absolutely, yes. And I know we're running very close to the time limit here, but I just want to get to this last question from the audience. We'll start with Ayelet, please. The question is, can we get your panel's comments on what the future will look like in, say, 5 years' time? That's the question. Go ahead. Yeah. I would love to hear from everyone on the panel, but just keep in mind that we are running out of time, so brief answers, please.
Okay. So I think the future is really going to look at additional use cases like the ones that I mentioned, and really creative ways to solve these problems that really go in the form of trust to the use cases that I mentioned, with starting with financial, but also service providers. How do we deal with account sharing? How do we deal with understanding that the user is really intending to do what they're doing right now? And I think that organizations are going to change. I'll talk about the organizational aspect to really think about trust and safety. And we're seeing some job titles already in the space of around trust and safety that are not 100% focused on fraud, but really that fraud and the customer experience, and taking the brand and safety into consideration. And I think that that's a great first step in breaking down the silos. And I do believe fundamentally that the future is going to be all around the adaptive customer experience, and ensuring that without introducing additional friction, and without verifying again and again explicitly with the user, but actually leveraging invisible ways or seamless authentication or seamless identification opportunities of the user, or not even of the user, but looking at is what they're doing good or bad, is what they're doing what they intend to do throughout the life cycle of the account, and offering that adaptive customer experience, allowing them to do more if the trust is higher, and changing the experience for them if the trust is lower. And there's kind of an estimate by Gartner that organizations who manage to do that within the next 3 to 4 years will actually see more revenue than those who are not able to introduce that frictionless adaptive customer experience.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Hussein, you already mentioned that you expect passwords to be going away within 5 years. Any other predictions?
In part, that we're going to move towards, we already have, but it's just going to intensify the customer first approach and user experience, and that UX and UI as a whole being the center of most discussions at all departments and levels within financial institution organizations.
Absolutely. And Rolf, what does it look like in 5 years for you?
So I think we will see substantially reduced reliance on passwords, OTPs, but also on traditional legacy risk signals, right? Where we have to collect thousands of risk signals in the hope that it adds real security, but in the end we find out that those are not substantially different from being bearer tokens harvested off a device, which are publicly available, and so any attacker could do the same and replay that in a sophisticated, slightly random. So I think we will see a substantially reduction there, and on the other hand, a more predictable and more convenient user experience, right? It's nothing better than just putting your fingerprint on your finger on a sensor, right, to authorize a financial transaction. That is frictionless, right? Whether I click a button or a fingerprint sensor, right? Not much difference from a convenience perspective, but there is a two-factor difference from a security perspective.
Absolutely. And Javier, what does the trust landscape look like in 5 years for you?
5 years is a long period to imagine, but I'll try to. What is true is that digital onboarding processes and biometric authentications is going to be something really usual in a daily task for all of us. I think that the same way that when Apple introduced the Touch ID, changed completely the scope of the biometrics on the devices, I think the deployment of these technologies, these processes in the financial sector is going to be open the same solutions to different sectors, governments, healthcare, and many others. So probably in 5 years, it's going to be really often to open an account, going to a hospital, and using the same type of solutions. And in order to happen this, what I think that is going to happen is that it will be probably a lot of combination in different technologies and partnership between companies like the companies we are today in the panel in order to bring the best solution to the end user. That's how I see in 5 years.
Excellent. Well, it's extremely exciting as somebody who's involved in the industry, sure, but also as an end user. Looking forward to further trust in the future. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining me today on this panel. Thank you again to Gary Dempsey and our partners at Money 2020 Europe. I also want to thank our sponsors once again, Knock Knock Labs, BioCatch, Onfido, and FaceFee. To hear topics about trust, digital identity, and finance discussed further, visit FindBiometrics.com and look for the latest episodes of the ID Talk podcast. All month, we are interviewing our panelists here further in the podcast. So if you're hungry for more information on this, check those out and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher. Thank you all for including. This concludes our webinar presentation. Stay happy, stay healthy. Thank you again for joining us.